Hello and welcome to YESC's fourth presentation in the Ask the Author series. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Andrew Marshall, who's joining us from the University of the Sunshine Coast. A quick reminder that this session is being recorded, and welcome to Andy.
Hi everybody, thanks a lot for coming along. It's a pleasure to give a presentation all the way from Australia over in the UK. It's a slightly less rare thing these days, I guess, but yeah, nice to speak to you all in York. I think we've got one or two from Australia here as well, so yeah, nice to see you guys as well. Jane's in charge of the slides, so if you could go to the first one please, Jane. So this is some research that's just been published very recently. It's basically the beginning of a whole project that we intend is going to last decades, based here out of the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia. But I also work at the University of York, where I've been based for, well, the last 17 years ago, off and on, yeah, it's a collaborative project. My co-I, Marianne Pfeiffer, was very centrally involved in the paper, along with Phil Platts from York, and Hamidou Seki from York, and also Rob Marchant from York, amongst various others. And also Robin Chasden in particular, also from here in Australia at the University of the Sunshine Coast. And various others who contributed data and thoughts and ideas as the process went along. So yeah, this is really the beginning of a project that yeah, it's going to be running for a good while now. Next slide. So this is the paper. It's appeared in a relatively new journal called Frontiers in Forests and Global Change. And those that don't know this one, it's a very up-and-coming journal, and I definitely encourage anyone who's not been involved with this journal at all to send stuff there. It's producing some really nice papers, and we're pretty confident it's going to come out with a very high impact factor when it gets one, hopefully next year. It's too young to have one at the moment. And yeah, I've enjoyed the review process. It's online, open access, and it's a very open an interactive review process. Is all online, and all the reviewers can see each other's comments, and it involves dialogue with each of the reviewers themselves. So yeah, it was a pleasurable process to go through. Yeah, if not quite intense though, because you do have to respond to every single reviewer comment. But yeah, we got there. So yeah, it's an overarching paper. Next slide. And the focus of the work is on lianas. Now, for those that don't know what lianas are, they're woody vines. So they're the kind of things that Tarzan swings on. They tend to drape themselves from trees. They tend to need trees for support to grow. But they also grow in this kind of way here, over the tops of trees, often killing them. This is a thing called kudzu in the United States. And the effect they have, particularly in areas that have been heavily disturbed like this one, is to swamp areas of potential forest and prevent trees from growing. So this particular example, kudzu, is an exotic thing, native to the neotropics, but spreading into the southern USA, causing immense amount of ecological damage and affecting the ecosystems quite hugely. So this is one example of an exotic. The next example on the next slide is another exotic species, and this is cat's claw creeper. This one's now invading Australia. There are many tens of different lianas invading Australia. Australia is a continent that's got a real issue with invasive species, and this is one of them. And you can see they produce these kind of ghost-like figures over trees, and most of those trees would once have been alive, and they've been smothered by this thing, which has prevented them growing and eventually killed them. But it's not just exotic lianas which can cause significant impacts to forest ecosystems. The next one is a liana from Australia. This is a thing called Meremia peltata, Cook's glory vine. And this is a native thing. Some lianas fulfill this kind of niche when forests get damaged, in this case by cyclones. Some lianas grow in very, very quickly, swamp the areas, cover the trees, and then again outcompete them for light. So although this is essentially a forest ecosystem, underneath those lianas there are trees trying to grow, seeds in the soil that represent forest species that would have been there if the lianas weren't dominating. But yeah, very visibly doesn't look like forest because these things are so prolific. So that's Meremia in Australia. The next example is a very similar thing from Southeast Asia. This is another kind of Meremia in Sarawak on the island of Borneo, again performing a very similar role. These are all tropical areas, swamping out areas of potential forest, covering trees and affecting the way that the forest recovers. And then we've got another example after this one, which is another native species. And this just emphasizes the diversity of these things. It's not always the same plant groups that do this. And this is a thing called Uncaria africana in Tanzania now in East Africa, which is a rubiaceae plant from the coffee family. So yeah, lots of very different lianas there, different taxonomic groups, but all performing a fairly similar niche, growing very quickly when forests are disturbed, smothering the trees and having pretty significant impacts on what happens to the forests afterwards. Next slide. So what we're trying to do is understand the variation among lianas. Lianas are not all the same. Some of them are very good for the forest. In fact, most of them are very good for the forest, but some of them, as you can see in some of those pictures, have quite a significant impact and can actually harm the trees. Lianas have been referred to as parasites, but that's not necessarily the right word, because many lianas don't actually harm the trees. They rather compete with them for resources, but don't cause any lasting damage. So parasites isn't really necessarily the right word. They get perhaps more correctly referred to as structural parasites, in that they need trees for support, but they're not necessarily taking nutrients from them, but they do compete for some nutrients in the soil. Next slide. So we've started coining a couple of phrases for how we can think of lianas. They really do, in most situations, have a very positive influence on the forest that they're in. They provide food for animals and plants. They contribute to nutrient cycling. They contribute to leaf litter production. And we also say they act as bandages. So in these areas where they're swamping forests that have been affected by strong winds or by logging, they actually protect some of those trees underneath and don't always kill them, allowing them to grow underneath, allowing the seed stock underneath to generate, allowing perhaps also the detritus or the invertebrate community to still persist, and eventually allowing trees to break through and the forest to recover. But for decades, foresters have been managing these things. They've been cutting them to encourage timber yields, to encourage trees to grow back faster. But in fact, if these things are acting as bandages, if they're actually helping the forest, it means it's leading to a kind of myth of trying to fast forward the recovery of forests. If we try and make things go too fast, the forest might not function as it should. It might not have the biodiversity value. It might not have the general functional processes. So there's a lot of questions to answer. But on the other hand, next slide, there are certainly a handful which are very damaging to forests. And these we're starting to refer to sort of informally as parasitoids, because like insects that colonize other insects and kill them, some lianas do fairly regularly kill the trees they're growing on, maintaining that state of open forest and potentially preventing carbon and biomass recovery long term. And in fact, the effect they're having is pretty serious. They're increasing in numbers in many parts of the world. The data are fairly limited on that, but they are increasing in response to CO2, in response to temperatures, in response to increasing damage to forests. And in fact, against other drivers of mortality in forests, they're increasing at a greater rate. They're not any other driver except from human influences. So there is something serious going on, which has led to a real rise in research and a lot of uncertainty at the moment as to exactly what's going on. Next slide. And this graph then is emphasizing the kind of increasing recognition of lianas. So this is one of the figures from our paper. What we're seeing is increasing research into lianas, but we're not just seeing increasing rates of research because of increasing research in the ecological field in general. We're seeing an increase in the proportion of papers that are published in ecology that are about lianas, and that's an exponential increase. It really is rocketing the studies into lianas now. And there are two reasons for that. One is that we're realizing the importance these things have globally in the way forests function, the way they recover. But we're also starting to realize that we just don't understand these open areas of forest. They're very hard places to work in, and traditionally ecologists like to go and have a nice time when they go and do their field work. Those of us studying lianas, we don't have much of a nice time because we have to crawl underneath these thickets and measure them and try and get to understand these rather tough places to work in. But what they tell us is something really, really interesting about how forests work, and something we're starting to understand something quite fundamental about what forests are doing and how they recover. Next slide. So our work in this area began a good while ago now. It was around well, 13 years ago I started gathering data on lianas, and I started becoming interested in these things because I'd worked in forests for about 21 years now. And when I first went into tropical forests, I noticed these big areas of forest that had no trees and were just covered in these vines. And others that I were with in the forest had to tell me that these were areas that are disturbed. They're areas that had been impacted in some way, mostly by tree felling. So yeah, in 2007, I just started informally gathering some data to understand what happens if we remove these things. What happens if we take them away? Does it help the forest or not? And there've been around 20 or 30 studies like this across the world in native forests. And what we found in Tanzania pretty much mirrored other parts of the world. And the graph in the top right shows this. In forests where we didn't manage lianas, if you compare the white bar there to the bar with the grey bar, you can see there's not much change in the 5 years across the study. But in managed sites where we cut the lianas, you can see there was a pretty big increase on average in the amount of biomass in those trees. So the trees were growing, they were dying less, and they were also recruiting new stems. New stems were growing in. So those three things combined led to a net increase in biomass. So a pretty positive response by the forest. So in this same paper, we also reviewed all the studies that have ever been conducted in the world on tree growth rates, mortality, and recruitment with and without lianas. And we found a pretty equivalent result on average. Pretty much every study, apart from one study in Uganda at very high elevation where conditions aren't suitable for lianas, showed that if we take lianas away or if they're naturally absent, trees grow faster. So that's a pretty striking thing. If we don't have lianas in regenerating forest, then the trees just don't grow as well. And it's led some to suggest that on a global scale, this is actually likely to threaten the tropical carbon sink, because there's so much disturbed forest in the world, much of it in the tropics, that it's going to be halting the amount of carbon that forests are able to absorb. And the second thing that's been mooted is that because we get areas with abundant lianas and areas with few, then there might be two pathways that forests follow, one fast pathway of recovery and one slow, entirely driven by those lianas. Next slide. So this led us in the next phase of our work to set up the FORCE experiment, the Forest Restoration and Climate Experiment. And we did this initially with some pilot funding from the university in York, which we set up the initial vegetation plots in Tanzania. This led to a big 1.5 million Australian dollar grant from the Australian Research Council, which is what's funding most of our work at the moment, to actually begin the process of understanding what's going on. Firstly on a local level in study sites across the world, but also then on a global level in terms of modeling the patterns and upscaling. So yeah, we've now got a network of forest plots, and in those plots we measure trees and lianas, also invertebrates and the climate in some of them, and we measure those over time, we manage some of them, and then with that we're upscaling the results to try and project the recovery of forests across larger scales using remote sensing and things like leaf area index photographs, which allow us to correlate the plot data to satellite imagery. Next slide. And the first stage of all this is to conceptualize what's going on. We need a firm scientific underpinning to the work. So the first paper that's come out, the one I showed you earlier, is setting out the kind of overarching hypothesis, the overarching idea for what we think might be going on. And we've called it the Liana Threshold Hypothesis, because what we're suggesting might be happening, and there's fairly good evidence for this, but so far slightly indirect, that there are thresholds in the forest, threshold levels of liana competitive dominance over trees, where lianas will start influencing forest recovery and preventing forests from growing back. And for those that aren't so familiar with thresholds, what we mean by a threshold is an abrupt change in the system that will lead to an alternative state. So if we reach a certain level of liana biomass or a certain level of liana cover over trees, we expect to see the forest jump from being a kind of closed canopy primary forest into a secondary forest that's covered in vines and not doing much other than maintaining its state. So that would mean that lianas are what we call feedbacks. They're potentially maintaining this secondary state and preventing it from recovering into a primary state. And these kind of thresholds are quite common in ecology, and I guess the most well-known example is illustrated on the right in tropical forests, and that's the relationship between moisture, water of any kind, in this case precipitation, and the amount of tree cover. Next slide. With increasing precipitation or moisture in forests, we see a threshold response. And that's why around the world we tend to see wet forests and we see dry forests. The level of drought, the level of fire, anything that's going to affect the water in the forest ecosystem is likely to cause it to shift into a drier state or into a wetter state if it's going in the other direction. And that's a threshold because it's an abrupt change. It's a change that happens fairly rapidly between a fairly small distribution of precipitation or water or other kinds. So that's what we're trying to look for in terms of lianas and forests, whether we've got a threshold relationship. Next slide. So just to illustrate that in terms of stability diagrams, so a threshold relationship is conceptualized something like this, with our green ball there representing primary forest and our red ball representing secondary forest. And so if there's a threshold in our system, we'd expect that if we go from left to right, disturbing our ecosystem, it wouldn't tip into a secondary state, a stable secondary state, until a certain point. But once it hits that state's maintained. The feedbacks are there, potentially lianas keeping in that state, unless we push it somehow in the other direction, unless we plant trees or manage that habitat, or something else goes on. So that's a threshold relationship. Next slide. But the thing is, what's likely going on is that there's not just one way that forests respond. Forests might respond in many different ways, depending on conditions. They might have a threshold response, they might have other forms of response. And this, surprisingly, hasn't been looked at in a huge amount of detail in forest systems. There are a lot of papers around the world, well, a few papers that have gathered data together from chronosequence studies or long-term studies of forest change to look at how fast forests recover. And it's very variable, tens to thousands of years for forests to grow back. So it really is variable. And again, there haven't been many studies to test what causes that variation and also how the variation changes in shape. So if you look at the top right-hand graph, this is a wonderful study by Porter across the Neotropics. So yeah, there are kind of 40 or so forest recovery trajectories shown there. And what you can see is that all of these trajectories have been modeled roughly using the same shaped line, an increase slowing with time. And what you can see is the lines are quite spread around the surface there, and that's because of the different kinds of forests. It's largely a water-driven gradient here, with the green ones representing dry forest and the blue ones representing wetter forests. But what you can also see is a lot of those lines don't go to zero. They're not showing the recovery of forest from no biomass or zero age right up to the current biomass they have. So it means we're kind of missing something in these models. We're not looking at that early point. We're not looking to see if we've not got a single simple curve here. Maybe we've got an S-shaped curve. Maybe we've got thresholds going on, and that's something that's what we're interested in looking for. It's not been tested yet whether these pathways are influenced by lianas and therefore whether there's a threshold going on. Remembering that we're inside moist forest here or inside dry forests here. We're not talking about transitions from dry to moist. We're talking about recovery of single ecosystems. That's another thing. So yeah, that's what we're interested in. We're interested in understanding this variation. So if we go to the next slide. So the second part of our hypothesis then is not only that these thresholds exist and therefore lianas are acting as positive feedbacks, it's that this is variable depending on biotic and abiotic drivers. It's variable depending on the climatic conditions, the topography at the levels of human disturbance. All these things are going to affect the way forests recover. And that means that we can see thresholds like this example, or in the next slide, we might see situations which are even more serious. And a kind of threshold called hysteresis is where in the secondary state, it's even harder to push it back into a primary state because the ecosystem is so disturbed, it's so disrupted, that it's not a simple process to recover it again. So it means if we're going to restore it and manage it, we've got to work even harder. Next slide. But at the other end of the scale, we might get what's called a linear response, where the secondary state isn't stable. It's going to recover whatever we do. If we chop the trees down, as long as the conditions are right, the lianas will grow, but not necessarily grow too rapidly, and therefore the trees will just grow back and the forest will proceed towards a primary state. And that situation is quite common as well. Forests do recover even when lianas are present. Next slide. But what we're also doing is introducing a recovery response that hasn't been demonstrated before. And this is actually what we think might be fairly common in these ecosystems, is what we're calling a pseudo threshold, is that initially forests have to go through a period of competition between the lianas and trees. The lianas are out competing the trees largely, the forest doesn't grow. But there's some subtle competition going on that eventually leads to the trees breaking through, either a single rapidly growing early stage pioneer species grows through, or the lianas have allowed the functioning of the ecosystem underneath, the seed pools, the regenerating saplings, to recover enough for the forest to become more healthy. And this actually mirrors quite a lot of the liana data out there. If you look at the growth of forest in early stages with lianas, quite often they're very, very subtly positive in terms of biomass gain, not negative and not zero, suggesting that they are very, very slowly recovering. But just when we remove the lianas, the forests do come back. So it is a threshold in that there's an abrupt change at a certain amount of liana abundance, but it's not necessarily a true threshold because it is actually still recovering. It's not a stable state, the secondary state. So yeah, this is what we're aiming to test. Next slide. And then the way we test that, there are various steps. It's not a straightforward thing to prove that thresholds exist, but the kind of central process is a diagram like this, which is called a response curve. And what we'd expect to see, that with increasing disturbance to the forest and increasing dominance of lianas, so by dominance we mean the competitive ability of the lianas over trees, so it could be measured by change in biomass relative to trees or cover over trees, etc. With time, we'd expect to see a point where the forest rapidly decreases in function and the biological response of the forest is not the same as a primary forest. It changes quite quickly. And the dotted line on that schematic there is emphasizing a case of hysteresis. So that if we're going back in the other way, if we've got hysteresis, so remembering that hysteresis is this more resilient, less resilient state. So if we're in a secondary state, it's harder to push into a primary state. We'd expect to see the recovery of the forest follow a different path to the left on the way back. So that's what we're trying to test. These response curves are very central to what we're trying to do in our research. Next slide. And then just to put that into context, then if we look at the response curves on the top there, the top three situations and the stability diagrams I showed earlier on the bottom, what we'd expect to see with a threshold is the top left there, where we've got a very abrupt change. If we've got a linear situation, we'd expect to see something more on the right, where as disturbance decreases, the forest just recovers in a fairly uniform way. But if we've got a pseudo threshold in the middle, we expect to see something that looks like a threshold, but we haven't got horizontal slopes in the secondary state. We've got slowly changing forest as disturbance decreases. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for these subtle changes to determine what's going on. But the challenge for us is to understand variation. So next slide. And this figure kind of brings that all together into our overarching hypothesis. So what we're suggesting is that on the left, we've got the drivers, the things that affect the lianas in the ecosystem, the things that are actually causing change. And the main thing is light. So as forests get chopped down, the canopy opens and high light levels come in. And that's what lianas respond to most. So when forests are disturbed, lianas grow fastest. And I'm talking about the prolific lianas here, not primary forest lianas. When I'm talking about lianas in this situation, I'm talking about a handful of species which grow very fast and proliferate, the ones that really are affecting the forests. But what we also see are there are various other environmental conditions which are likely to affect lianas. And there's a fairly limited information on this. So the kind of schematic on the left there is a kind of general projection based on some of the research that's carried out within moist forests. But yeah, certainly open to test with time. But things like seasonality and temperature certainly generally lead to positive changes in lianas, whereas decreasing amounts of water are less good for lianas, and various other factors as well. So what we're suggesting is that where these conditions favour lianas, we're going to get a situation on the top of this graph where we've got hysteretic responses and stable secondary states. So it's going to favour situations where the forest won't recover very fast or won't recover at all, where lianas are dominant, not trees. But if conditions favour trees over lianas, we'd have something like the bottom right situation in the stability diagram there, a linear response, where the forest does recover because the trees are favoured and therefore they outgrow the lianas. And we're going to get something of a gradient in between. So we're going to get more potentially pseudo thresholds potentially, where there's favourability towards trees, but also lianas as well. So there's good, strong competition going on, and then the forest recovers, and then grading towards the threshold and hysteretic responses in the worst case scenario. And that's going to vary according to climate. So if we go up elevation gradients, for example, we'd expect to see a change from a stable secondary state to an unstable secondary state. And likewise, as we proceed from the tropical regions out to temporal regions, the same kind of pattern. We'd expect to see forests tending not to recover so well in the tropics, where conditions are humid and hot, great for lianas, but more towards temperate ecosystems, the forest will tend to recover. So that's our overarching hypothesis. Next slide. Yeah, and so important I mentioned the word resilience here, that it's all about how resilient these ecosystems are. So what we're saying is that where conditions favour lianas, the forest is less resilient to change, to effects of disturbance. It's less likely to recover from disturbance, less resilient to its disturbance where lianas are doing well, where they're growing very fast in these open areas. Next slide. And then this is phrasing it in another way, a more perhaps accessible way to avoid the graphs and the kind of more science element of it. So what we're saying here is that in a natural forest that's not heavily disturbed on the left, in primary forest, if trees fall down or small amounts of wind cause some disruptions, the forests will maintain itself in a primary state because other trees will grow up. Forest gaps will be filled with time, lianas will grow, but they're not going to impact the state of the forest. But where there's really heavy disturbance, huge increases in light levels, the forest could go either way, depending on the other drivers that are going on there. So in conditions that are favouring lianas, we'd expect that forest to tip into a secondary state, which would then maintain itself with the feedbacks from lianas, and other secondary vegetation would kick in, and it could cycle around in that state, potentially even for decades. We do see these open forest states can persist for decades. But again, that's not necessarily permanent. The forest can then trip out of that state if we carry out restoration management, or if the lianas are acting as bandages rather than parasitoids, and therefore helping the trees to recover over time, and it gets to a point where the forest is able to recover and tip back into the primary forest state. So that's what we're kind of suggesting is going on. So overall, we're kind of suggesting really that where conditions allow, that lianas run the whole thing. And where lianas aren't there, other forms of secondary vegetation like grasses will run the whole thing. They're kind of really in charge at this stage as long as the climate allows. So it's pretty significant. If we can understand what these things are doing and how they interact with trees, then we're going to really understand something quite fundamental to what makes forests work and how we can manage them. Next slide. So what we're doing at the moment then, this is just a little bit beyond the paper now, is we have sites set up in East Africa, in Tanzania, sites that we're about to set up in Australia. So there's Alan and Gute, their PhD student, working in Tanzania, and Emma McIntosh working in Australia. And we are setting up plots, vegetation plots of trees and lianas. In some of these plots, we're cutting lianas, but we're cutting them at different proportions. And this is the key thing. We're trying to produce these response curves artificially by varying the proportion of lianas in the ecosystem. And if we can do that and show we get these S-shaped abrupt curves, it potentially means that we've got thresholds, because we're seeing rapid changes at certain levels of lianas. But we need to do that artificially. It's very hard to get natural variation. We're also trying to sample that as well. So yeah, we're testing these response curves at individual sites. We're working in Tanzania and Australia already, but I'm just writing grant proposals for us to move also into Vietnam, and we think also probably Peru in the neotropics. So we can start talking much more broadly. And my last trip to the UK actually started making me think that really we could use a temperate example of this at some point. If we can do this with blackberry in the UK, which does the same thing, blackberry is essentially a liana. It grows and swamps areas of forest in the UK, do exactly the same experiments, then we can actually test this in a temperate ecosystem as well. Because yeah, these things affect forests in temperate climates as well, but just generally not so much. So yeah, that I hope will come with time as well. Next slide. The data is coming out slowly. We presented a small amount of data in the concept paper. That was really just outlining overall concept rather than showing what's going on. I guess the key thing is the first challenge we have is that lianas are really tough to measure, because if you can imagine, they're growing in these very open areas with very few trees, and therefore they're matting together, forming dense, kind of tight thickets. And all we can do is find the base of that liana. We can't measure the whole thing. It's impossible because they're winding round each other. They're really tough things to work with. So all we can do is measure its diameter. But what we're also doing is we're harvesting whole lianas to try and understand how big a liana is per unit diameter. And previous data have shown that's quite variable. But actually in our area, these show that the first sampling we've done here, harvesting lianas between 1 and 10 centimeters diameter, actually has produced an astoundingly clear relationship between the diameter of lianas and their biomass. So it does suggest that if we just measure their diameter, it's enough to determine what biomass they have. Trees is a bit easier. And on the right there, just emphasizing the challenge we've got here. There's some data from Gabon using different current general global equations and African equations predicting biomass for lianas based on diameter. And you can just see the variation there. If we use off-the-shelf equations for this, we just don't know we're getting it right. So yeah, we need to harvest these things ourselves and understand what's going at our own level. But of course, environmental factors affect that. This pattern's going to change as we go up the elevation gradient. So it's going to be a big job for us to get this right at all climates and in all areas. But yeah, it's a positive start here. It shows we can do it. So that's the next step. In addition to this, we're also starting to explore potential for LiDAR, and Catherine Waite, I think, is joined in this meeting, and Catherine's going to be hopefully investigating that, because yeah, lianas are so tough to study. If we can reuse remote methods or even ground methods, put the LiDAR, the laser scanners inside these thickets, we can potentially sample them in one fell swoop rather than crawling through the things and getting scratched up, spending hours to measure just a very small area. So yeah, that's something that certainly needs to come with time as well. Which takes me to my next slide, which is the kind of beginning of our use of remote sensing and global data to take what we're doing at a local level and project it across a much larger scale. So yeah, Catherine's work that she's going to be doing is going to be looking at plot data from across the world, from lianas and trees, and using our models from regional equations to try and project what's going to happen to forests with time, as lianas and trees compete with each other and as climate changes. And our first map we produced here it's more a map to kind of provoke thought and get researchers thinking. It certainly is based on fairly basic data just to get a crude idea of what's going on. This is from the paper. And what we've done here is we've taken published data on carbon stocks in tropical regions, and we've taken published data on the level of canopy loss in these regions, and we've taken environmental ranges that lianas tend to occur in, and produced this map showing the distribution of carbon in forests where lianas occur. And from our calculations, we reckon that there's around 29 to 56 petagrams of carbon deficit in these forests because of loss of canopy. And lianas, of course, if they're affecting recovery of canopy because they are growing in open areas, will certainly be responsible for some of this. We just don't know how much. It's very unlikely they'll be responsible for all of this because some forests are naturally open, but they'll be certainly responsible for some of it. So that's what we're trying to get to. So yeah, emphasising the potential impact is huge. I mean, this is about 5 times the amount of carbon from the annual fossil fuel emissions across the world. But yeah, that's very much an upper estimate, and Lianas will be having a fractional impact on this, but we just don't know how much. So that's Catherine's job from now on. Next slide. Okay, that brings me to an end. So yeah, just to emphasise, our main donor is Australian Research Council. Lots of people to thank, including data providers and those that co-authored the paper, and our hard-working field assistants who have to crawl through places like this to understand the vines. Next slide. The research is certainly going to be updated on our website. We have a ResearchGate page where the Force experiment is giving updates. And our Twitter page is also a fairly good place to keep an eye out for what's going on as well. Okay, I think we've got time for questions. I don't want to show any more slides. Let's leave that last one there. I've got a few extra if we want to go to some other things. Maybe just go back to that last one, Jane. Okay, yeah, maybe the next one, Jane. Maybe leave that other one with the contact details on there, and if anyone wants to go and chase up, they can. Thanks a lot. Okay, can you guys see my video? And can I see all your videos somehow? I've got no idea how to do this.
1 second. Can't see videos from attendees, unfortunately, on the webinar.
Oh, right, okay. Well, you can see me, can you? Okay.
But
yes, keep smiling.
Yes. We can, if they can put questions on the question and answer page.
Oh, right.
Or they might be able to raise their hand. There's a to ask a question. If someone puts a name on the question and answer sheet who wants to ask a question, we can unmute you.
I think I might have heard someone speaking very quietly there. I didn't hear Rob Marchand's voice today. Maybe not.
One sec. Oh, we've got one there.
There's a question. I can see one now. Yes. Right, let me click on that. Yes, I can see it.
So Susanna Fleiss has asked, with your current knowledge, what degree of liana cutting would you recommend to help restore a highly degraded closed canopy rainforest?
It's very tough to say at the moment. And this is kind of what we're trying to answer. And we're working with managers in East Africa and Australia who are very interested in this. My perception is it would be awful to go into a forest and clear everything in these open areas, because those lianas are so important. I mean, the key thing is that when we cut these lianas, they don't tend to die. So that's important. So they are going to grow back. But it can damage them. And certainly if we cut the wrong species, then it's going to have a big influence. I mean, looking at early data, I mean, I would be cutting, most of the lianas in areas, above 50% to allow trees to recover, but not over the whole extent of forest, just in tiny pockets, like a hectare or something like that. But again, that's my kind of early impressions rather than driven by the data at the moment. It's kind of driven by early data and my visual impression of what's going on. I do suspect in some instances you probably would need to cut all the lianas in that small area rather than a proportion of them. But that's what we'll understand. I mean, it's likely that if conditions are very, very favourable to the lianas, they're just going to grow back so quickly that it's going to be very tough. But something like 50% or above is what I would expect.
Does that answer your question, Susanna? Do you have any follow-on?
No, that's great. Thank you.
We have another question from Rob Marchant. How important is it to understand the character, timing and duration of the disturbance as a driver of liana forest state and recovery?
It's certainly going to come into what's going on, and we'll certainly be recording levels of disturbance. I mean, the amount of disturbance, the amount of removal of trees is going to be the main driver, because that's the structural element of the forest that is having an impact. But the way the forest has got there is also going to be important to the recovery as well. So pulses of disturbance over time will have a bigger impact possibly than a single disturbance event of the same size. So that history will be very interesting, but in many cases is going to be very tough for us because the disturbance has happened over, decades in many instances. In Australia, perhaps we can get to that because we know the cyclone events that would have hit the forest, so perhaps there's more chance. In East Africa, I think it's going to be a much bigger challenge to get to that because the forests have kind of been nibbled away. And so the disturbance, it is due to past logging, but it's probably more likely due to constant removal of trees for local use. So yeah, it could have big impact. And there is a great paper out there that we cited in our review that goes into that, the effect of different patterns of disturbance. So it will have an impact, but the key thing for us is looking at the overall level of biomass removal of the trees, and that will be our main the main thing we're looking at.
Do you have any comeback on that, Robert?
No, that's fine for me. I mean, clearly history is important, and understanding changes in directions in rates of disturbance, I guess, is key. I mean, like Andy says, it's a challenge to get at that information, but a challenge, I guess, a number of us are trying to rise to.
Yeah, and actually, something that would be very useful, and it's harder to get in Tanzania because of the fairly poor records, but the time since the kind of major logging event will be key as well. But again, I'm just starting to get involved in Vietnam, and they've got wonderful maps of exactly when forest areas were cut and how much is removed. No doubt there's other things going on as well. And yeah, that is in Tanzania to some extent, but it's kind of handwritten stuff in the back end of forest offices and likely not recorded, perfectly either. So I think getting to that is going to be quite a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, and just on that issue, I mean, we have got this massive amount of really detailed inventory of how much was removed, when, by who, other things like treatments for weeding, how much was spent on weeding forest plots and things like this, largely from the colonial era. Forest officers kept immaculate records. Unfortunately, a lot of them are degraded now, but
yeah, exactly,
a real good potential there to bring in that sort of deeper history into understanding these sort of future responses and challenges.
Yeah, great. Yeah, no, it's good you've got that, and I think it's worth us looking at what's there and what's available. But yeah, what it won't capture is what's happened between. And that that's no doubt partly why these things have been so open for so long, probably because they've been nibbled away since those colonial times. But and that could be a thing as well. I mean, it could be that we're seeing such long-term stability in these liana thickets in East Africa compared to, say, parts of the neotropics where forests are recovering, but again, variably, because people are using it. They're going in there and they're taking poles and things. So yeah, no, it'd be great to look at that, Rob. Yeah, let's chat about that.
And I've got another question from Rob saying, how important is it to understand the character?
Sorry, that's the same question.
Oh, sorry.
So yeah, just
Oh, it is, yes.
Answer it again.
And have we got any more questions?
I guess something I didn't mention, I see that we've got Charlotte Raven joining in. Thanks a lot for joining in, Charlotte. Is that an element we're starting to explore now also is the kind of health of the detritivore community. And the early data we've got from Tanzania is that if we compare the millipede composition in these areas, we've chosen millipedes because they're very abundant. And visually, I think they're the main thing that's driving breakdown of leaf litter to soil in our areas, probably together with ants and termites. But if we compare the composition of these millipedes in liana dominant areas with very, very few trees and areas of closed canopy forest, we actually don't see a lot of difference. And so that's leading to me, and we'll publish this, probably next year, is the next paper I'm working on now, is that the lianas are maintaining that shaded state to the extent that even the detritivores are still able to live there in the diversity and numbers that they do in primary forest. And that's pretty striking, because there's been plenty of research around the world of open forest, of disturbed forest, showing that the invertebrate community is impoverished, but actually it's kind of suggesting to us that it's kind of a melting pot of primordial, equivalent of primordial soup in forest terms, of stuff that's causing the forest to grow back. And I think that's been, to some extent missed in the liana literature, that although these areas are messy and they're non-forests, they're thickets really, although we call them secondary forests. Actually, they're places of huge importance for the future with the lianas there. So yeah, that's something that we're starting to go into. But yeah, invertebrate sampling's a big challenge. So yeah, Charlotte's got a big job to try and work out which ones to focus on in Northern Australia, because even here in Australia, where there are plenty of scientists, it's there's not enough knowledge to survey the invertebrate community thoroughly enough to get everything in a short space of time. So yeah, it's a new direction we're pursuing.
And has anyone else got any questions? I can't see any coming in. Right, have you got anything else that you'd like to leave us with, Andy?
I don't think so, but if anyone's interested in getting in touch and understanding how to join in and get involved, then do let me know. As I say, we've got a permanent sample plot network set up in East Africa and soon Australia, and we're keen to collaborate with people who want to answer their research questions. So yeah, we've got researchers working in our plots answering various questions. So yeah, if anyone could think of a use for a set of permanent sample plots across an elevation gradient and a disturbance gradient, that at some point we might cut the lianas in, or some not, we've got control plots as well, then yeah, definitely let us know. The more data we can get at this early stage, the better. But yeah, just other than that, thanks a lot for joining in.
Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to us from Australia. Given the time distance, it's much appreciated.
No worries at all.
And thank you very much. And we've got another talk next week from Dr. Colin Beale on African elephant poaching rates. So I hope some of you can join us for that too. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.